In the beginning, she gave me of the tree, and I did eat.
No, Odysseus, let him rack his brains with you and the other captives how to fight.
Guilty.
Impossible. Trust me.
No one to weep for me, my friends. No wedding song.
Amo verumque cano, Troiae qui primus laboris Italiam
Dante ha fatto il pieno e per gli altri è rimasto ben poco, which means that Dante filled up.
I was the more deceived.
Confess that you were very bad to hurt my feelings.
Cried Candide, I'm through.
Enough. Who are you then?
Part of that force which would do evil evermore, and yet
She was eating a maraschino ice at that precise moment.
There is no
When Gregor Samsa woke up one morning, he found himself changed in his bed into a monstrous dung beetle.
And welcome again now to class 18, which means we only have 6 to go. I'm going to miss you. It's painful, only 3 weeks to go or whatever. We move today now from Voltaire to Goethe, which doesn't sound like a big jump, but it is indeed, because we move from the Age of Enlightenment to the Romantic Age and all that that implies. So I think most of us will find ourselves very comfortable in the Romantic Age, because we probably are still living in the Romantic Age. This part of the 20th century has been described as the latter part of the Romantic Age, beginning in the late 18th century into the 19th century. And we read Goethe's Faust, which is one of the classics, with a capital C. This one's gigantic. We read part 1, as most people do. There is a part 1 and a part 2. And I don't know many people who have read part 2, to tell you the truth, who aren't actually Goethe scholars or comp lit majors or whatever. So let's start with observations about Goethe's Faust. Comments, questions, observations? Yes, Peter.
Just an interesting transition from Candide to Goethe in terms of the happiness aspect, because Faust defines part of his happiness is the pursuit of it.
Yes, yes. You're right. He's driven. He's driven by a need somewhat different, obviously, from Candide's. Candide's need, to point the difference, Candide's need is a little bit more earthbound, I think, than Faust's need. But yeah, it is happiness that he is after. Yep.
And Faust is seeped into academia, but he wants to toss that aside. He would like to indulge in sensual pleasures before he gets too old.
That's right.
Now, Carl Jung would call that midlife reversal.
Yeah. A lot of that going around, huh? Yeah, you're right. I mean, here is a man who has trafficked only in words. As the play begins, and indeed becomes, as everyone does who traffics only in words, realizes that there is an enormous gap. I'm going to sound Wittgensteinian here, but that there is an enormous gap between words and things, between words and what they represent. And he has a desire for much more than what his learning can bring to him, for what his intellect can bring to him. So it's almost a frontal assault, isn't it, on the age before it, on the Age of Enlightenment, which put reason and logos at the center. Barbara.
An obvious comparison would be Satan striking a bargain with God, just as he did in Job.
Precisely.
And in this book, Goethe talks about heavenly love. Man has part heavenly love, or heavenly good, and love. And he chooses love in this book, but Job never renounced God. And I see a comparison between Faust and
Absolutely.
Job.
The prologue, obviously the prologue in Faust is essentially modeled on the prologue in Job. And indeed, the same kind of dramatic irony is available to us as we read it, because we know, don't we, from the prologue that Mephistopheles will not be successful. We know the end of this before the play, the action of the play begins, and we also know from the prologue, that this kind of divine compassion, if you will, for the nature of man, which is always to strive. And it's given a kind of divine sanction in the prologue that is tolerant, let me put it that way, that it's tolerant of what Faust will do during the course of the play, because he knows that that spark that is in man will eventually lead him back. And of course the play, it doesn't happen until part 2, but the process begins in part 1 with the long Margaret loves, or Gretchen. What do you have, Margaret or Gretchen in your text?
Gretchen.
Yeah, all right, yeah. I'm assuming that was both. Some of you have Gretchen, some of you have Margaret.
Two of the angels, the ones that guarded the entrance to the Garden of Eden, so Adam and Eve could not go back in. Wasn't Raphael one of them?
Mm-hmm. And Michael.
And Michael, yeah.
So yeah, there are lots of parallels to stuff that came before too. You can see the Miltonic echoes, I hope.
I was just going to say, Milton, he almost quotes him in that part about no matter how low he sinks, the good will come through and it will be your downfall, he says to Satan.
Yeah, the Felix Culpa notion of the fortunate fall, and that wanting to will evil but always being an agent for good. Mephistopheles defines himself that way, and he's absolutely correct, as it turns out, although he doesn't seem to know that in every cell of his body. Mephistopheles' character is wonderful, isn't he? He comes on as a Spanish galant at first, just rakish, and
Goethe gives him a lot of good lines.
Great lines, absolutely great lines. I completely agree with you. Yep.
I also see an analogy with the tree of knowledge.
Okay. Yes.
in the Bible, or in the Bible, and man's fall. Mm-hmm. And Goethe seems to say that through Faust, I guess, that we know. What we know we don't use, and what we don't know we haven't achieved. I'm saying it badly, but the stuff that we know we don't seem to use, and the rest we don't know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the whole question of knowledge in the play is interesting. What's different, of course, in this play from what's its most famous predecessor, I guess, there have been Faust legends through time. Probably the most famous one before this would be Marlowe's. I think you have to go all the way back, don't you, to the Elizabethan theater or late Renaissance theater for Marlowe's Faustus. And for Marlowe, Faustus was a lesson in an abject lesson in limitation. It's the damnation of Faust, the tragical history and damnation of Faust. And what his Faust wants, of course, is knowledge that has been denied man, and he wants to use it to a dark end, and is punished for it. It's an authoritarian age. It's an age of obedience, if you will. I guess the great epic that, forgive me for continuing to do this, but the great epic that sums up that Renaissance Elizabethan view is Paradise Lost, which begins of man's first disobedience. That word is right at the center of the epic movement. Obedience ain't the watchword when we come to Goethe. When we come to Romanticism, it's quite different. What's coming to the ascendancy in the Romantics is not some abstraction of state, and not some abstraction of great chain of being and hierarchy and all of that sort of thing. It's primacy of self. You all know about Rousseau, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who wrote his Confessions. And the pronoun, obviously in any confession, the pronoun most used is I. I. What happens as you come into the Romantics is it's as if the third person is replaced by the first person pronoun. The I comes to the fore. And what we want to know is not only the thoughts of the I, of the individual, we want to know the feelings of the individual. So feelings and emotion become very important in the Romantic Age. Not so important in the Age of Enlightenment. Indeed, having read Tartuffe, you know that one of the watchwords of the age is be careful of those feelings, be careful of those emotions, they can get you in trouble. As we come into the Romantic Age, and with the ascendancy of the self, those emotions are seen as a vehicle to higher truth. They're not something that you need to check, they're not something that you need to keep locked up, but they are a means to a higher truth. It's a very different worldview, isn't it? Very similar to our own. Very similar to our own. You can, I can sit through any number of classes and I will have students say to me, how do you feel about, and they never ask me, what do you think about, it's how do you feel about, you know? And if well, I better be careful. I was going to pick on a particular state that I summer in every summer that's over on the left coast, but I won't name it. But you know, feelings become the primacy of all. Yeah. So this play, the difference between Marlowe's, which was this lesson of the bounds of knowledge, do not go beyond certain bounds because you will be punished for them, you'll be damned, is turned into, in Goethe, not as an object lesson, negative lesson, but rather Faust becomes a hero. Faust is a hero in a true romantic sense of the word here. His willingness to break free of bounds and to take it where it leads him. We don't know whether it's going to take him to salvation or whether it's going to take him to damnation as we read part 1. Indeed, most of you, I would think, do not like Faust a whole lot by the end of the first part. Would I be right about that? What he does to Gretchen is pretty awful. But he will be redeemed in part 2, and this journey of his. Yeah, I've ruined it, haven't I? Now there's no reason to read it. Isn't that funny? The way people, you know, if you know what happens, then you can't. Then it's spoiled for you. I'm sorry, I got sidetracked. Yeah, he's redeemed in part 2, and we find out that this seeking after experience becomes a positive thing rather than a negative thing. Yeah.
In fact, this response to the question, do you believe in God? At the end of that, in our translation, it's translated as feeling is all.
Yes, right. Yeah. Feeling is all is exactly the line. Yeah, that's the usual translation of it, by the way, is feeling is all. That's probably the MacNeice. I bet you it's the Louis MacNeice. It doesn't matter. Listen, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have said it. It doesn't matter. But yeah, feeling is all is exactly right. Yeah. And you've got to trust that. And you've got to not be afraid of it. And there are any number of structures, aren't there, set up to make you very afraid of your feelings. You know, usually to confuse them, even to give them a moral coloration. And to say, if you're feeling them, even though every human being who has ever walked the planet has felt them, you know, and it might be perfectly natural for you to feel them, you're not supposed to feel them, so stop feeling them. Yeah, it's extraordinary. Mm-hmm.
I felt in going through it, and I had the advantage, maybe it's not, whatever. I have 2 copies. One is in verse, and the other is free form. And I could look at one and then look at the other to see how they differed one to the other. Yeah. But it became clear to me all along that he was being used as a tool for an end, with the assumption that he was willing. And as we proceed into the second part, we find out that one of his salvations was the fact that he reacted to these hasty, terrible things that
Mephistopheles.
Satan.
No, not Satan. Mephistopheles.
Yeah, Mephisto did. Suppose thinking he knew Faust's mind, and all the time there was that inner goodness in Faust, who, although he had these desires, wasn't about to do other people in to achieve them.
Right.
Not that way.
Yeah. The wager is very interesting. The wager is all. I mean, it really is most important, the wager in the prologue, because it sets the contest. And so we discovered that this is not a play about forbidden knowledge. I bet a lot of you went into it thinking, oh yeah, I know about Faust, it's about forbidden knowledge. Because that's the Marlowe Faust that most of us know, the Faustus. This Faust is really not about forbidden knowledge at all, I think, it seems to me. That's not what he's after. In fact, wouldn't you agree, he doesn't want any more knowledge. Yeah, he's had enough of that garbage, you know. He's had all the knowledge the brain can handle, and he's lost in a dark wood at the opening of the play, contemplating suicide. You know, he wants considerably more than that. You'll have to tell me what he wants. I'm not sure. I'm not sure I know, he says slyly. But really what the debate is, it seems to me, between God and Mephistopheles is about the very nature of humankind. What is Faust's nature?
He's reaching out to his own humanity.
Huh?
He's reaching out for his own humanity and others.
Well, maybe, yeah, maybe that's exactly what he's doing. Or maybe he's being, in part one, very Mephistopheles-like. That is, I, me, ego, all me. Gretchen, oh, I'm sorry this happened, but, you know, hey, I needed the experience. She was there.
But the desirability was because it was put into him. He was seeing a girl under circumstances which were made, that were contrived to do this.
Well, he was allowed.
Yes.
Let's think of it that way. The hedge was off. You know, the chains were off.
Was primed for him.
Yeah, and here she was, a nice 14-year-old girl. Remember the age? Did you all go, ooh? You know, here's a nice, you know what I mean by nice, right? You know, here's a nice 14-year-old girl, and he's going to take advantage of it.
There's a hint, too, in the beginning when the student enters that Mephistopheles will go on and on. He won't lack for candidates.
Oh, for sure.
And the student is so enamored.
Well, Wagner is really he's one of the funniest characters you're likely to meet. The pedant, you know. He is just preposterous, isn't he? He's a young, and that's what's kind of poignant about it. I mean, it's a young Faust in the making, you know. You can guess that was Faust.
As the fire at the end of the Black Dogs as he walked.
Yes.
Didn't I see?
Yeah. Yeah, no. Well, yeah, Wagner doesn't see anything like that, right? Yeah, he's much more earthbound, I'm afraid. Yeah. Talk to me about the reading of this. Tough play to read, huh? Did you find it difficult? Most students do. Most first reads are fairly difficult to do. Yes? No? Am I putting words in your mouth? Or?
No, I found it difficult to read. As a matter of fact, I started out and I wasn't that much interested.
Yeah.
But what got to me when I got past the first part, and the more I got into it, I found myself drawn. I didn't want to put it down. I still don't think I was doing that well trying to get around the language, but I couldn't put it down because I wanted to know how things worked out.
It is a difficult read. I mean, we've just got to confess that outright. It's a very difficult work. And it's a work that is really unfinished in many ways. Goethe wanted to go back and insert some scenes. He wanted to change a few scenes. So he himself did not think of it as completely finished. It was designed for a production, but can you imagine trying to produce this thing? Wow. I mean, extremely difficult. This is a philosophical drama in the sense, or what the 18th century used to call a closet drama, I think. That is, it's designed to be read rather than performed. It can be deformed. I must say. It can be performed, but it is an extremely difficult thing to do. It takes a lot of very expensive stage effects to make it happen.
Gounod did a good job with the opera.
Yep, sure did. Yep, yep. It is very much on that scale, isn't it? Yeah, on that kind of cosmic grand scale. That's another thing, of course, the prologue gives to it. The prologue gives to it a kind of epic sweep. You get a sense almost in the beginning of this that you're reading almost a dramatic epic rather than a play. It's a very wordy play. You notice there's a lot of
invoke the muse, the heavenly hosts.
Yeah, right. Yeah, right.
They go up to the Empyrean realm.
Exactly, and down to the pits of hell as well.
Right.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, I'm going to ask my classic weekly question that I ask. So yeah, here it comes. So your kids catch you reading this. It's a subversive act, right? And they say, well, reading Goethe, Faust, huh? What's that about? And how do you answer? What is it about?
I'm not going to touch that.
Come on, now you gather we're going to have 50 minutes of dead air if you don't. We'll start doing hand puppets. How about this? Eric, I'm going to pick on Eric. I got to do that once a week, Eric. I'm sorry. What do you think? What is this thing about?
It's about a medieval scholar who, dabbling in magic, manages to call up contact with the devil, who's made a bet with God that he can take his soul away. This first part of it, his soul is engaged in the life of the senses, in a reaction against the dryness of scholarly life, and he's plunged into an affair with a young woman.
Yeah. Okay, that's a good answer. I mean, that's plugged right into the plot line of Faust. And yes, the wager is for the soul of Faust. But what precisely is the wager? I mean, what is it going to take for Mephistopheles to win?
Faust will have to say right out loud and know and feel that he's satisfied.
Yeah, that he wants to stay in the moment.
Yes.
Yeah.
This is it. This is it.
Yeah.
I'm satisfied.
Yeah. And we discover, of course, from the prologue that that ain't ever likely to happen to the human being. But it could. It could, and it has. And Mephistopheles is going to give it his best shot. And so the first way in is through a young woman. Interesting. We've heard that one before, haven't we? Where have I heard that before? Let me think. Anybody want to go back to Genesis on that one? Yeah, we've heard this before, haven't we?
And actually, Faust is taking great risk because he doesn't know that he will be saved.
That's correct.
And so, he's willing to make this pact and get the sensual pleasures. But, at the time, I don't know that in his time or this time, I don't know that many of us would make that pact without being sure of redemption.
Talk about hedging your bets. Right. That's funny. What is his problem? Help me out here. What's Faust's problem? Why would he make such a pact? What a goof.
He feels estranged from the world, I feel, that he knows he's lacking something and he's been driven in one direction. Now he comes to a point where he has discovered more than he thinks he can handle with this conjuring. And he says, whoops, I'm not ready for that. There's got to be somewhere else to develop myself. And it's to be like other people. I think he sees himself as lacking human contact because people come to him as an authority. No matter what he says, pearls of wisdom are expected to fall from his lips.
Remember
and
the way
he's
the peasants
tired of
treated him, yes.
Yes.
The peasants worship him. Yeah.
And no matter what he did, or as he said, we cured them, but we didn't cure them. We're the ones who killed them.
Right.
He and his father both.
Right.
And he wanted to be like others.
So he's painfully aware of the limitations of human knowledge. What else is he aware of? I agree with you. He realizes that human knowledge is not going to do it.
He's so lonely, really.
And he's aware of his age, too. He's getting old. Was there mention of him being 60? Or did it give
No, I don't think it's that precise.
No. But anyway, he knows, he has all the knowledge he wants, but there's something lacking in his life.
Yeah. Can we run with this? I want to know what it is.
To bring some mysteries to light.
Yeah.
He says, and it's, I think, the classic example of the sorcerer's apprentice. You want something without, and you don't know what the other side of the coin looks like yet, and then you end up biting off more than you can chew.
Yeah, you get the sense, don't you, that knowledge is taking him to the outer crust of what he's after. But if he wants to get to the core of wisdom, he's got to have to use something other than his brain to get there. Yeah. And what's it going to take to get him there, of course?
Well, one thing he knows is it's not his best developed parts. He's going to be using parts of himself that aren't developed, especially unlike his intellect. And his feelings are probably part of that.
That's where I'm trying to lead you. I think you could see me driving this one down I-57. Yeah, the logic, the word is only. Remember when he comes to translate the gospel, he decides he's going to do a new translation of the gospel after essentially being saved. You all didn't miss the symbolism of the time of this tragedy. I mean, he's about to commit suicide, you remember, because it's all meaningless, and he doesn't know what life is all about. He's just had a horrible experience with the earth spirit who has reminded him of how puny he is, how tiny he is. I mean, what's the modern analogy? Walk out on a beach at night, right, and look up, and man, do you get a sense of your infinitesimal size when you do that, if you're aware of what's up there. That's Faust, and it's just, how can I live with this kind of puniness? And he pours poison into a glass. He's prepared to take it, and then something in him responds to the church bells, which he remembers from childhood. Please, this is a really important romantic idea, this notion of plugging into your childhood. That childhood is a very special time. Childhood is a time of authenticity, that we lose as we become adults. You know that notion. I mean, we're all familiar with that notion. And that triggers that childhood memory, and he is literally saved by the Easter bells. Yeah. And then it's going to proceed to translate the Gospels, and we get into that wonderful, it's not words, it's deeds. He posits word versus deed. Doing versus non-doing. That's essentially the stakes here in this piece. And of course, Mephistopheles is the very embodiment of non-doing. Yeah, he's the spirit of negation, right? The spirit of cynicism, the spirit of ennui, the spirit of despair. And that's the battlefield for Faust. Chad?
There seems to be a little parallel here between Faust and Dante's Divine Comedy, where when Dante was going through the whole thing, initially Virgil was his guide, reason was his guide, but reason could only take him so far.
That's correct.
And at that point, Beatrice had to take over, which was something beyond mere reason, mere logic, to get to salvation. And it seems that Faust is following a somewhat similar path, in the beginning being the scholar and discontent with the knowledge he has, yet upon hearing the bells, it didn't. What reacted to the sound wasn't any rational or logical thought, but something more primal.
Precisely. Something more primal is very well put. Yeah, that's exactly right. And you'll notice that Faust, in a sense, doesn't need a guide, because you cannot say Mephistopheles is his guide in any real sense of the term. He is his guide in the sense that he makes the Gretchen episode happen. He does make that happen. But interesting, even in part one, Faust recognizes his responsibility for the Gretchen episode, and that's an important little step. That's what Faust is going to pick up on in the second part, is his awareness to accept responsibility and his willingness to accept guilt and responsibility for Gretchen. Yeah. It's a very interesting play, in the way it sets up its dichotomies. It sets up its two poles, and each pole, I'm getting a little corny here and I'm not sure where I'm going with it, but it's as if each pole has a kind of field of energy around it, you know? And Faust has to make his way through the two poles, the two fields of energy, and discover which way he's going to go.
Isn't he saying, Faust, that man is made up of the carnal and the spiritual?
Yes, indeed. The two souls abide in my breast. I mean, we really ought to look at that section. And you're right, that's the classic romantic despair. To be aware that you are earthbound, to be aware that you are sensual, to be aware that you're limited by those senses, but to simultaneously be aware that you have within you a spark of divinity, which is the imagination which transcends all of that which we just talked about and is aware of realms quite beyond the physical. Now, frequently that's also beyond the realm of language.
That's why he talks about act rather than the word.
Absolutely, yeah.
Act.
Yeah.
But doesn't he give himself up to, love, lust?
Yes, he sure does. Don't we all?
Well, you were making an analogy of, he's in a wood or a man on the beach looking up
right.
and saying, well, how small am I?
Yeah.
But the other side of the coin is how wonderful the world is. Look
Yes.
at the universe.
Yes, and he
doesn't do that.
No, yes, he does. I think he does. There are any number of set pieces in here, in Faust, that are extraordinary descriptions of the physical surroundings. There is, the Easter morning parade. Remember when the gates of the city open? You got to imagine now we're in a medieval German walled city. You can imagine the last time they've seen the sun. You know what I mean? Cold and dank and dark. And here's Easter Sunday, which is a sunny day in this play. The gates open. Medieval cities are walled to protect you, so you're confined in your movement. And in spring, they open up, and there's this great opening out. There's a procession going out, and there's that marvelous set piece of that. And then there's the even better piece where Faust imagines himself looking down at nature, and you get that absolutely extraordinary description of the mountainside and the valley and the meadows. So that is another classic. You're absolutely right what you say, and that nature is a classic source of inspiration for the Romantics. It is a way of through nature. It's a way of penetrating to a kind of life-affirming spirit in the universe.
Don't you think he sells out, though? He makes a choice?
I don't know, Barbara. It sells out is so strong. I think old Heinrich is in a realm he's never been in before, and after Walpurgis Night, you all read the description of Walpurgis Night, which is just a riot of sensuality. He's primed for the Gretchen episode. And Gretchen is willing. I mean, that's what's... I don't know how you feel about Gretchen. I'd really like to talk to you. Shall we do that now? Let's talk about Gretchen. What is your attitude toward her? In the Sturm und Drang, ever hear that expression? Sturm und Drang movement, storm and stress movement, in German Romanticism, Gretchen is a type. The literature of the time was peopled with Gretchens. She is how do you put this? The sinlessly sinning girl. You get the paradox, but you get it, don't you? She's the sinlessly sinning girl. And her fate is just awful. And not as bad in the play as it would have been in real life. In real life, had she married while pregnant, you don't even want to hear what they would do at the wedding ceremony. Please know they would not be throwing rice at the wedding. They'd be throwing chaff at the wedding. And it's one public humiliation after the next for the unwedded pregnant. And that's the sorry condition she finds herself in. Do you sympathize with her? Is she not fleshed enough to sympathize? Is she another Ophelia? What's the deal here?
She was really set up by Martha, who made it so logical or easy for her and arranged the meetings.
Yes, the go-between.
Yeah. She became the pimp.
Yeah,
I think it was mentioned as that in here.
Yeah.
But it was really All her hormones were starting to work. Here was someone who was flattering her with things she never thought she'd get. Again, he did it, not Faust. Knowing vulnerable spots in each individual, he had such advantage over anyone that he chose to deal with. And especially this young girl whose mother wasn't able to protect her and didn't know what was going on. I felt strongly for her, and in the second part where Faust sees her shrinking from the side of the revelry on the mountainside, trying to keep away from it, and he's trying to approach her, and can't. He, at this point, feels guilty for what happened to her, how he would have helped, how he would have understood. All his humanity, in a good sense of the word, was aroused by seeing her. And I felt that they were both tools. I'm trying to avoid the word Mephistopheles.
Yes, yeah. Yeah, so, okay, so you put them on trial and you find them not guilty for reasons of victimology.
I think that they were tools. That they were used for his purpose, which was a bet with God.
Yes, okay. I don't, but that's...
There were the jewels, of course, too, that started.
Oh, yeah. Oh, sure.
Thinking, who could have sent me such a wide array of these jewels?
But she was more than willing to unlatch her door for him
her
to
willingness,
come in.
I think her willingness was uncovered when she accepted the second
chest
of jewels and hid it from her mother and took it to Martha knowing that she would have umbrage there. So she's not as innocent as...
I agree with you. I think she does participate in her own downfall. And I agree with you too. I mean, I don't think I'm forced into an either or. Clearly they're manipulated, but clearly she participates, I think, in...
Manipulated is a very good word.
Yeah. Yeah, they are. And but they each participate in their own fate as well.
And they have choices.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, they certainly do have choices.
And probably the most painful, just to follow the idea, probably the most painful scene in the tragedy is Valentine's response to his sister, which is... oh, it's just awful, isn't it? Just awful, yeah.
It reminded me in many ways of Ophelia with her brother and her father both telling her what she shouldn't do and how could she have led him on knowing she'd never get anywhere.
See, Ophelia is a good analogy to make because several of the songs that she sings in Faust are based upon songs that Shakespeare had Ophelia sing in Hamlet. Did you see your footnotes on that, I trust? Yeah. Or just remember it from having read Hamlet. But I think it's logical to make the connection between Ophelia and Gretchen, excuse me. But the major difference between the two is Ophelia is less in charge of her fate, it seems to me, than Gretchen is, and for that reason less tragic and more pathetic.
Well, in my book, it's Margaret. So I think Margaret wants the affair as, well, almost as much as he does. And she wants him to believe in God and say he believes in God. And he never does say that. No. He says he believes in love. Right. But that is good enough for her.
Yeah.
And we were talking about feeling before, and when we were talking about Tartuffe, you mentioned intent.
Yes.
And there's a lot of intent in this that we should look beyond.
Yeah,
I mean,
there sure is. You're absolutely right. Yeah, that's really one of the differences, isn't it, that when you move from a play like Tartuffe into a play like Faust. Yeah.
First love cuts deep, you know, that's... you always hear that.
Yeah. Well, it's first love for both, which is really quite striking. And if you think about it, each is a projection of the other's needs, right? I mean, that's quite revealing, isn't it? But here she is, a 14-year-old girl, and she's in awe. At first meeting, you remember, she just cannot believe that such a dignified doctor, as they keep using the phrase dripping with irony, could show any attention to this 14-year-old girl, and of course her head would be turned. And conversely, here's Faust, who has led a life in the study, and not just any study. We're told it's a Gothic study, you know what I mean? And the Gothic architecture forces your eyes only in one direction, right? And that's up. His eyes have been up, and for a change, Yeah, well, I don't know how to put this. You know, he's bombarded by middle-aged hormones or something. You know, and out he goes.
They we're talking about the first love, and there's one line in there where they liken her first love to a form of idolatry, and that's kind of the sort of spell she was under.
I think so. Yeah. That captures it perfectly, doesn't it? Yeah. It's a kind of worshipful attitude. Yeah. So how does Faust? Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, John.
Isn't part of this tragedy not their being enamored of each other or whatever they do in that process, but the tragedy of separating or not being enlightened enough to see how the carnal and the spiritual work together, and all the other peoples throughout everything we've read, their low social consciousness, if they can't see how the things mesh, how these aspects of our humanity mesh, and then people like these two are victimized by that.
Well, you plugged right into one of the dichotomies that are deeply into Western civilization, and which we still wrestle with profoundly, which is the notion of reason and emotion being seated in two different places, right? And playing out in two different ways. You get me? You know, it's the classic cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am, meaning, you know, reason, and we don't talk about this. And when we do talk about this, it's usually because it's going to either lead us into trouble or it's going to get us into some kind of transcendence. And there is no synthesizing to speak of at all. We continually make that dichotomous division between head and heart. Yeah, what are you going to be ruled by, your head or your heart? And it's a rather stark choice, isn't it? You know, yeah. When you'd like to integrate them, but we don't know how.
This is very Greek too, isn't it?
Yeah, sure is.
Yeah,
sure is. That's why I say it's embedded in our culture.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Other cultures, which I'm not as intimate with, having been born in America, no surprise, you know. But there are other cultures for which the synthesis of the two modes are less dichotomous. And of course, what's happened for us over time is that whole, well, I'm getting on a soapbox here, but a whole host of sins have been attached to the passions, to the emotions, as well as sins have been attached to reasoning. And it's hard to shake. It's really hard to shake. We just changed the model. You get sin, then you get, as a metaphor, up to about the 19th century, then you get disease. It shifts, you get it? It shifts from the religious to the clinically medical. So what's wrong with you is, you know, whatever. And now it seems to be moving into biochemistry. Right? I'm not kidding. I'm quite serious about this. So our models change for this, but our language doesn't. And our oh boy, I'm going to get real heavy here now. Hang on, guys. And our language, of course, sets the parameters of our thought. So it's no surprise that we would still be using metaphors from hundreds of years ago to describe what's going on.
I think we can all agree that man without either his mind or his emotions is rather dismal, as you were pointing out in the first part of the trimester. And it also seems like to me that the tragedy here is that these two characters found in Gretchen and Faust seem caught up in, you know, in opposite, like Faust in his reasoning and her emotions, and they both find themselves in trouble. And I guess the lesson is that we can't afford to have one overrule the other, and that in tangent. Gretchen overlooked consequences, as did Faust, and he wants to go back and mop up, whereas if he uses reason correctly to begin with, and she could, well, if she used her reason and he used his emotions, they might have come out a little...
Yeah, that's very well put. You know, this is what I meant earlier about they're fulfilling themselves in the other. You know, like you say, you know, one's the emotional 14-year-old, and a girl, of course. Right? Have you noticed since day one, it's the women who are passionate and who are emotional, and you know, and it's the men who are rational. And the men who are heads of state, heads of government, heads of family, heads of, we still use that expression.
It's chauvinistic.
Hey, I'm the one who pointed it out.
There's a third element in there, the spirit, you don't forget the spirit that hovers over Gretchen. She's very much aware of when Mephistopheles enters the picture. His eyes bother him, his lips are too thin.
Yes.
She, in a sense, tells Faust, why are you having this guy
That's it. That's her instinctive goodness, of course.
Yeah.
So in the face of Mephistopheles is picking up all sorts of signals about him that one less pure would not pick up. Yeah.
And even in the last scene where he's trying to urge her to come with him. See, the door is open.
Yes.
Just take one step and you're out. And she can't do it because she says in one line, she can't go. She'd have a bad conscience anyway.
Yes.
And she'd be carrying that for the rest of her life. So she doesn't see anything for herself except death.
Myself am hell. Wherever I go, am hell. Remember from that guy who wrote something centuries ago? Yeah, it's that same notion. She can't leave the dungeon. Yeah, the dungeon again is just a metaphor for her emotional state or spiritual state at the time. Yeah.
Voltaire gives us warning on reason, doesn't he?
Sure.
Too much reason.
Oh, absolutely.
Will get us into trouble.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
You end up with metaphysics for Voltaire, and if you end up in metaphysics for Voltaire, you may as well be on Mars. It's got nothing to do with anything. Get out of that stuff and get down into. I'm sorry to keep doing this, but Milton did the same thing in Paradise Lost. Be lowly wise. He didn't want the idle metaphysical speculation either. There was that sense that the best use of reason is to teach you how to live well, and don't worry about that other stuff. Yeah.
And even Moliere, too, in Tartuffe, that any love, any overbearing passion can lead us awry, too. So there are the two dichotomies. And moderation.
You got it. Yep. That's exactly what Tartuffe is about as well. It's a classic tale of a head-heart split. Yeah. So why is this guy a hero? Why is Faust a hero?
Well, he does feel bad about leading Gretchen astray. But he will not let himself out of the release of Mephistopheles' hold.
Yeah, I'm wondering what. Let me come at it a different way. Usually, what you have in a hero, especially in a classic, which is what we're reading here, but usually these things endure for some reason. Both in their time and beyond their time, is that they're saying something about us that is permanent, something that stays with us. And usually the hero sums up certain virtues, certain qualities of character that we think are very important. Oedipus's integrity, pursuit of truth, all that sort of stuff. Aeneas's characteristics of virtus and gravitas, and you get my drift. What is it in Faust? What are his principles? What does he stand for?
Compassion.
You think? Yeah, you notice that comes out and it kind of sits there, doesn't it?
He does feel bad about Gretchen.
He does feel, but he moves on. Yeah. So let's not turn him into Alan Alda here. I may get in trouble for that one. Right.
I think he has a sense of responsibility for the things that happen. As I said earlier in the second part, when he wants that forest of linden trees so he can see more of his domain. And he mentions that he would like this and that he would give this other property to the old couple. He doesn't want to do them out of anything. He just has a great desire for what they own, and they've resisted him. Then when Mephistopheles...
He did it.
I have once I've made up my mind, I'm tongue-tied, then I've done it. I can't get away from it. Anyhow, he is so rash and he's so violent in fulfilling the desire of Faust. And from that point on, Faust feels responsible. I mean, he's big enough to accept the fact that it was his remark which caused this terrible thing to happen to other people, with Gretchen, with the older couple, and imagine in other incidences besides. That he is developing as a feeling person.
Yeah, you're right.
He wasn't before.
Yeah, you're right. From that point on, the relationship between Faust and Mephistopheles becomes one of a struggle.
Always.
It's not, it is not a simple, I'll tell you what to do, you make it happen, and we'll live happily ever after. It then becomes a struggle. Yeah. Yeah, good point. Peter?
Well, in answer to your question, I think one of the things is he puts himself to the test.
Yes.
But you don't really see the end result until part 2, apparently.
Yeah, I know. You're cheated.
So,
I know.
Yeah. So at that point, you know that he is, he's testing himself, and hopefully he wins in part 2.
That's a good point. He willingly leaves the study to go out into the world and test himself. Absolutely true. Yeah.
But he's not aware of that bargain, is he actually, that Peter's talking about? That he's fighting against Mephistopheles?
He is by the end of part 1.
Yes, I'm saying that this is it's inherent in him. It is not something he's deliberately chosen to do.
That's correct.
It's a moral goodness which is coming to the fore.
It's precisely what was predicted in the prologue.
Yeah, the trials,
right.
and he becomes stronger for it.
Yep.
Yeah.
So could we say that he's wanting to alter a paradigm?
Yes. To use a modern expression.
Yes. He's had his paradigm, and it's been a scholarly and intellectual existence.
Yeah.
And this is how life has been for him. So he senses there's more to it than that.
Right.
He doesn't really know what it is. He has some ideas. He's a hero because he then acts on that. He sort of drops his old career, you could say, and goes after, he's not sure what, but he starts walking.
That's a tough one, isn't it?
Toward it, yes.
Yeah.
That is, and you could say any of us could do it, but how many of us do?
Yeah. There you go. I think you're really plugging into, this was very nicely done. The group is really starting to plug into what's at the heart of this tragedy, which is that awareness that we all have because of the two souls which inhabit our breast. We're like the grasshopper, Mephistopheles says. Remember? Terrific metaphor that walks in the grass but is also capable of flight. You know? And that's us. That's exactly what we are. We're capable of those wonderful flights. And they're grasshopper flights. They don't last a long time. They don't go real high, but they're just enough to get us up off the ground and aware that we can fly. Peter Pan here, and then down onto the ground again. And so and up again if we're lucky, right. So we're aware that this is out there. We're aware that there's something more than what we have. And it takes a certain courage, doesn't it, to leave the study, to use a metaphor, to leave the study and have as your only guide. Now, unlike Dante, who lived in a much more stable time, who had a guide called Virgil, reason, that could lead him on this journey to Beatrice. When we come to the post-industrial revolution, which is where we or just at the Industrial Revolution, all those old paradigms, to use your word, have collapsed. They're not working anymore. And the only guide this guy has, as it turns out, if he has any at all, is Mephistopheles, the cynic, the naysayer, right? The negative, the non-doer, the one who will tell you, no, you can't do it. No, you can't do it. No, you can't do it.
The one who wants to do him in.
Well, yeah, right. The only thing he wants to do is negative. Yeah. And really, the only guide he has, if you think about it, let's not think of Mephistopheles as a guide. Mephistopheles is more a means to experience rather than a guide. Really, the only guide he has is his own sense of personal autonomy, because that's the thing that really gets him out of the study. He's been told that this will bring him to truth. Study will bring him to truth. And he's learned no. And it's his personal autonomy that gets him out. He also knows religion, has been told, can lead him to truth. And his answer is no. It's not working for him.
So really in his in his quest for these mysteries that he wants to discover and to carry on the grasshopper metaphor, he's really cultivating and widening the cultivation of his own garden.
Yes.
And going beyond what his little plot.
That's very nicely done. Yeah, that's a nice segue from the class before. That's a nice way to think of it, isn't it? Is yes, his garden is widening, or another way, his study. To use the terms of the play, his study has widened. Yeah, and rather than the books, he's using the book of nature, which has traditionally been, as you may or may not know, has traditionally been an avenue to divinity. You've all heard that metaphor that God wrote 2 books. He wrote the Bible, the Logos, and he wrote nature. And it is through the created world that one can also arrive at the divinity. Yeah, yeah, that's nicely done, and it ties in very nicely with Candide that we had talked about earlier. Yeah. And even with, well, you guys can do this yourself, but even with Milton before that, and Tartuffe before that, and right on back. Yeah.
Well, you can even say that with his autonomy then that enables him to have the experience with Gretchen, doesn't leave him unscathed by that, because he does acknowledge his part in what happens to her.
Oh, absolutely.
Which puts him ahead of some other people we can mention.
Yeah. All right, yeah. Well, what he does for the first time, and what Mephistopheles is unable to do, is to break through his ego and to become aware of the actuality of another self. You remember the wonderful exchange between Martha and Mephistopheles. Are you married? Have you ever been married? And remember, Mephistopheles is dancing around the answer. He's never saying yes or no, and she finally gives up. She can't get any. Married? Of course he couldn't be married. He could never recognize the actuality of another self. Mephistopheles is trapped within that eye, as was Faust. That's the contribution of Gretchen, you see. That's why her love is redeeming, is because for the first time he can become aware of the actuality of an other self, and therefore to love. That's not something that Mephistopheles is capable of, for the obvious reasons, right? Love is creative. Love is a spark of doing, It is not negation, it is not denial. Mephistopheles stands for everything that is not love, yeah.
He's becoming a more rounded whole person.
Oh, absolutely. Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, Faust is truly a larger man at the end of part 1 than he was at the beginning of part 1.
He's developed another part of
course.
himself.
Yeah.
And that ability to recognize the other.
Yes.
That is crucial to love.
It sure is. And it's becoming increasingly. This is another. Now we're going to see. Now I'm going to look forward a little bit. Wait till you see the next few things you read, how this becomes a dominant issue in the 19th century. How for too many people we get wrapped up in the self to such a degree that we are unable to recognize the actuality of other selves. You'll read the story of a Russian guy by the name of Ivan Ilyich, which is kind of John Doe, who leads a perfectly upper middle class life. And it is horrible. And it is because of that being trapped in the self. And we got to let it go. I'm getting a wrap-up time. So, yeah, thanks for your attention, and we'll see you next time. Yeah. Had to get out quickly.